You're watching HuffPost Live. I'm Ricky Camilleri. This past Tuesday, Grand Theft Auto 5 was released, and in its first day on the shelves, it posted an unprecedented record $800 million in sales. Just the day before, Aaron Alexis opened fire at the Washington Navy Yard, killing 12 people. Now, apparently, Alexis was addicted to violent video games, and due to the release of the most historically contested violent video game coinciding with this shooting, several news outlets have once again begun the conversation of whether or not violent video games cause violence in real life.
Dr. Keith Avalo, last time he was on the program talking about this, he said that these games, in many cases, need a warning, simply so people know that they can be addictive and psychologically damaging.
Yeah, a lot of people do it, have absolutely no problem, and I believe there is warning on a lot of these games. Isn't there for adult content only?
What about frequency testing? You know, how often has this game been played? Maybe there's some sort of, and I'm not one to say get in there and monitor everything, but if this indeed is a strong link, right, to mass killings, then why aren't we looking at frequency of purchases per person, and also how often they're playing and how many times? Maybe they time out after a certain hour.
You go to your room.
On this.
Fox and Friends, so insightful. Joining me right now to discuss what has actually happened, if anything at all, to a generation that has grown up with Grand Theft Auto and violent video games. We have Carly Ocurek, Assistant Professor of Digital Humanities at IIT, David Ryan Pogler, author of Wisdom in the Age of Twitter, Dr. David Greenfield, founder of the Center for Internet and Technology Addiction, Jack Thompson, anti-violent...
Has any of you seen
please, we'll go to you in just a second. Jack Thompson, anti-violent video game activist and former attorney. Carol, I want to start with you. You were quoted in a Mother Jones piece that discussed violent video games and the studies of their effect on the brains of young men, or the demographic that generally plays these games. And these studies have been going on since 1984. Talk to me about what we've learned from these studies, what you've learned, what the prevailing notion is coming out of, 2 generations of studying violent video games on the effects of young men.
Well, the American Psychological...
Well, Jack, hold on. I'm going to Carly first. We'll go to you in just a second.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Carly, go ahead.
Well, sure. My first point would be that, in fact, most gamers are not young men. So, we need to think about gaming in a more broad way. Most gamers are adults. A third of gamers are adult women in particular. And so if we're going to talk about gaming, as something that young men do, we're actually only talking about a finite subset of who games.
Mm-hmm. But one of the things, the main question sometimes with gaming effects is we're talking about these lone wolf shooters, which are predominantly men. And I think a lot of the times when we talk about the effects of these games, we're talking about the effects on the aggression involved in young men. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Sure. If we look at the research over media aggression over a long time, we see this come up with comic books, we see it come up with novels, we see it come up with a lot of different media. And I think it gets very hard to separate whether, people interacting with media are influenced, or if perhaps violent people choose violent media. The Catcher in the Rye was very, very controversial, was blamed or implicated in a number of crimes, depending on how you want to frame that. And, I think at this point, we've moved on from that particular discussion, but there's still some debate, I think, about whether or not that's accurate. And again, much of the research, if you look back to the initial studies, what they're showing is not as pronounced as what gets reported.
Mm-hmm. And The Matrix has also been blamed. Marilyn Manson has been blamed. The movie Taxi Driver has been blamed. There's been several media outlets or several pieces of art that have been blamed for violence caused by young men. Jack, you take a different perspective. You're an anti-violent video game activist. You've been doing this for a number of years. You are sort of, if I may say so from what I've read in the past week, a thorn in the side of the game bloggers out there, and you've sort of started your own war with them at times. What is it that drives you to be a violent video game activist, an anti-violent video game activist?
Well, what drives me is sitting in the living room, for example, of the parents in Paducah, Kentucky, whose 3 daughters were shot and killed by Michael Carneal, a 13-year-old person who obsessively played the game Doom, also was enamored of the Basketball Diaries movie with the school shooting scene in it. And that changes your life when you sit with people whose hearts are shattered. There was a community that was forever changed by that school shooting. Diane Shetke, who's a renowned forensic pediatric psychiatrist trained at Yale, testified in Michael Carneal's criminal trial that but for his consumption of violent entertainment, he would not have done what he did. This is someone who had never fired a handgun before, and yet because of his video game play, discharged 8 rounds, 5 of which were fatal headshots, killing 3 girls. And I'll conclude, and I know there are other views here, but the American Psychological Association, which is not exactly a collection of right-wing nuts like me,
you just characterized yourself as a right-wing nut, Jack.
I have a sense of humor too. You have to when you have to.
Good for you.
When you do this kind of work. But they have repeatedly found in multiple studies, disagree with them or not, that there is a causal relationship, not a mere correlation, but a causal relationship between violent video game play and increased aggression in speech and then in actions, and sometimes resulting in violence. So there is, according to the APA, harm done across the continuum, some of which can result in violence, but harm to everyone who's a young person who plays these games because they process the games in a different part of the brain than adults.
Well, how young are we talking about? Because one of the things that these games do have ratings labels on them, and they're not necessarily meant for those under the age of 17, 18 years old. And when we talk about someone like the Washington Navy Yard shooter, he was in his mid-30s. He was not a young, impressionable, developing brain. He didn't have the developing brain of like a 16-year-old kid.
Well, there's a problem with adults playing these games 18 hours a day, which he did. You got to wonder about somebody like that. And if this was
I think, well, Jack, not to interrupt you, but I think that's the clear point. You have to wonder about somebody like that, not necessarily the game.
No. Yeah, but life is complex, and you can have multiple causative factors for an event. And the problem, well, let's cut to the chase here. The problem with video games, and we can talk about the problem with kids. That's an issue which even the video game industry with this age rating system acknowledges, and yet Grand Theft Auto 5 is being sold to minors across the globe. But the problem is there are 2 sides to the coin. One is the appetite for violence, and even if you don't think that they increase the appetite for violence, they train, let's say, to grant the argument, a violent predisposition in a certain way to make it a more efficient violence. For example, the Navy Yard killer played a game, Call of Duty, which gave him training scenarios which he carried out. And this is why the military uses violent video games to break down the inhibition to kill, and also to teach killing scenarios, tactics, strategies to individuals. And so even if you don't buy it causes people to be violent argument, it makes them more efficient killers. And that's very problematic.
David Pogler, we talked yesterday, and we were talking about you consider yourself a tech ethicist. Where do you fall in terms of these games making people efficient killers, as Jack Thompson has just told us?
Well, I think obviously one of the major concerns is going to be people who are already unstable. I think my main concern is you're going to have that blurring of the line between the virtual and the real life. Specifically, kind of looking into wearable technology in the future, something we haven't talked about a lot is, are we going to see that blending between the video game industry and the movie industry? If you look at what George Lucas was talking about recently with Steven Spielberg, he's really going to see kind of that hybrid type of form. So you kind of worry that there's going to be more of a visceral impact when you're having more of a story development that causes you to empathize potentially more with that first-person shooter game.
I want to pull up some comments right now from some of our viewers. This is from Foxy Shazam, a very regular commentator, one of my favorites. Says, this all comes down to parenting. Violent anything desensitizes. Yes, games can become addictive, and as with anything addictive, one needs more and more. Sometimes it spills over into real life to get that thrill. Well, Dr. Greenfield, how often does video game addiction play into this violence? What is the causal relationships between the addiction and the violence itself, as well as desensitization?
Well, I mean, my big take on all violence, all forms of violence, especially video game violence, which has a very powerful reward system wired into it, is that, one, the continued exposure desensitizes people to the experience of violence. But the other big issue is, along with the reward structure, is that it teaches them a skill set that they might not otherwise develop, especially the first-person shooter games. So I have a real problem with giving people, in the name of entertainment, a technology that, one, desensitizes violence and then teaches you how to commit violence more accurately in the name of entertainment, and then elevating people's levels of dopamine. And those studies have been absolutely supported. When you put people in a PET scanner or a functional MRI, their brain lights up like a Christmas tree when they're doing these games, especially when they hit the reward points that are designed by the gamers to keep them to game. The idea is to keep people gaming because that's how these games make their money. The other thing is...
But Dr. Greenfield, in terms of the rise of in dopamine, so many other activities have that happen in the brain.
Yes.
There are so many other activities that involve rewards that have that happen in the brain. Why would we single out video games in terms
But you don't have, sex, for instance, will elevate your level of dopamine, but unless you've got some magical power, you're not going to have sex for 8 or 12 hours at a time. Or you're,
unless you're Sting.
Speak for yourself, Dr. Greenfield. Come on now.
okay.
I'm 60. I'm 62. I can endorse that view.
So the point is that nothing is engaged in at the level that I see people gaming at in terms of a form of entertainment or dopamine elevation, unless it's a narcotic like cocaine, for instance.
Carly, you are a video game player as well as someone who discusses it in the media and for a profession. Talk to me a little bit about what Dr. Greenfield is saying in terms, how do you feel about this in regards to video game addiction, 8 to 12 hours a day of dopamine rise and sort of learning how to do these things that you would otherwise not learn how to do in terms of more effectively killing people?
I mean, I certainly don't have that many hours in my day, but I guess the question for me is not necessarily, I'm interested in the impact, right? But I'm also interested when we start talking about whether this should be regulated or what those regulations should look like. I think that's actually a more salient question because this research fuels into those discussions. But for example, in the United States, we have a very limited history of policing media in that way, right? We tend to rely on organizations like the RIAA or the MPAA that set up their own rating systems, and those have this illusion of being somehow legally binding, but they simply aren't. And in fact, you could let a 10-year-old into an NC-17 movie, and your company might fire you for that because of company policy, but you wouldn't be breaking any law.
Well, let me respond to that as someone who did practice law for 32 years and had to argue these issues in courtrooms and so forth. We had obscenity laws, not suggestions by boards, on the books in this country before the Revolutionary War. And we have obscenity laws on the books now in 48 states. The problem with the Grand Theft Auto games, there are a lot of problems. Well, one that's very, very difficult is that you have sex and violence together, and you have violence visited upon prostitutes with whom you have just had sex. The problem with that is the Japanese found in training their soldiers in World War II that they would become more efficient killers if you would reward them after brutalizing them in training with geisha girls and a night of sex for them so that they associated violence with the pleasure of sex. These two, and I'm a layman on this, but I know that from instruction I've been given by people that are experts, the sex and violence control parts of the brain are very proximate to one another. So here you have a game being played by teenage boys in which violence is wedded to sex, which is making rough sex and violence more likely to occur. This is
I just want to bring up one thing. I don't want to get away from this violence and sex conversation, but I do want to bring up one thing in terms of young boys in America playing these games, because the Washington Post did a 10-country study, and they said it turns out that the data doesn't support the connection between video games and violence. The world's 10 largest video game markets yields no evident statistical correlation between video game consumption and gun-related killings. And now, as someone, I grew up playing violent video games. I grew up with guns in the house. I had a 20 gauge shotgun as a birthday present when I was 13 years old. I used to shoot clay pigeons with my father, and I had Cinemax late at night in my house. I personally can say I can personally say that I have none of these sort of psychotic issues that we talk
You're
about.
a pretty